Nicole,
What's
welcome back to Real Pod. Thanks for coming back.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You were my first person I thought of when I thought I want to do an episode really diving into mental illness. We talk a lot about mental health on the pod, and I'm sure you can more beautifully than I can talk about the difference. I assume mental health is obviously everyone's like overall state of mental wellness, and then she's already looking at me like, okay, I'm just gonna stop. Here it is. Tell us.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception when we talk about mental health as if it's the absence of negative, quote, negative emotions, right? Negative mood, negative affect, or as if it's the absence of like having to deal with real shit. Like we all go through difficult things in life, some of us more than others. Mental health is present when we have sort of the capacity, the strategies, also support system to navigate, right? The sort of ebb and flow of difficult things, of stress that come in our life. So it's not just like this like fluffy experience of positivity. It's the ability to like be in things and sort of withstand it and be resilient through it. Right. And so mental health is actually characterized by that sort of balance between negative mood affect and positive mood affect and what allows someone to do that. Whereas mental illness, hallmark of mental illness is a cluster of symptoms, right? Where when those are present over a duration of time, they impact functioning. So mental illness becomes disordered when there's an impact in functioning in important areas of life. And so that's kind of where the difference lies. Like you can be mentally healthy and still have a low mood over a period of a few days, right? So I think it's important to acknowledge that mental health isn't the absence of going through hard things or doing difficult things or just being in a shitty mood for a couple days.
Right. When we talk about personality disorders, like borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, I feel like in my own life, I've known people who have been born seeming to struggle more with the symptoms of those disorders. And then I've also met people who I feel like it wasn't until later in life they mentally took a big 180. Mm-hmm. What's the difference in people being born knowing this would maybe be their trajectory, or they don't know, but it's kind of in the cards, and someone who experiences great trauma, which triggers it?
Yeah. There's a genetic predisposition, but there's quite a bit that's unknown about personality disorders and how they develop and why they develop. It's easiest to think about it in terms of a biosocial or biopsychosocial sort of model, right, or theory, meaning like it's the nature versus nurture kind of concept. Maybe you have a predisposition towards something, certainly with certain disorders like schizophrenia, like personality disorders, like bipolar disorder. If there is a family history, you're more predisposed to it. That being said, they're still fairly rare experiences. So then we look at what is early childhood history like, and it's kind of important to separate personality disorders from bipolar disorder or anxiety, depression, schizophrenia. Folks who have personality disorders are often like incorrectly stigmatized or labeled as like kind of evil, or we treat them as they're less than in society. And it's helpful to think about it in terms of biologically, maybe they were sort of had a higher predisposition towards certain personality traits associated with, let's say, narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. But then the environment reinforces those personality traits, which then sort of leads to the set of thoughts, how they think about themselves in the world, how they relate to other people. Remember, disease in psychology is defined by functioning, right, in important areas of life. So how they think about themselves in the world and how they relate to other people, that then creates a sort of impact on their functioning, right, which then we label it as a personality disorder. That person isn't able to function in the society or culture in which they exist. For most personality disorders, we can think of them in some ways as trauma disorders, right? Because with narcissism, it is excessive adoration or neglect that leads to that sort of cluster of characteristics that we know as narcissistic personality disorder. For borderline personality disorder, individuals who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, often we say, this is where biosocial theory is helpful. They're sort of born with, we could call our emotion system like a weather system, right? Some of us have more of like a California weather system, right? It's like more of a sunnier disposition. Sometimes the like marine layer will set in. We'll have like a few sort of episodes of rain that are much needed, but like it goes away. Like we pay taxes for the good weather here, right? And so that's their like kind of predisposition in terms of their weather system. Other people are more like the deep south or Florida, right? Where it's like pretty stormy. And so when you have a pretty stormy weather system for your emotion regulation system, right? You experience emotions more intensely and maybe more frequently. Then what happens is if that's how you are and you're having a difficult time getting your needs met in your environment at home, because when you express your needs in an intense way, it's invalidated or dismissed, then what that does is it pulls for more intense actions and more intense sort of behaviors, which is why we often see suicidal ideation or behaviors, impulsive, risky behaviors with individuals with borderline personality disorder. Because what happens is when they engage in those behaviors, the person who's typically invalidating otherwise says, oh my God, I need to pay attention to you. And so it reinforces that this is how I get my needs met by sort of this high conflict, high emotional intensity. With borderline personality disorder, though, if you think about emotion regulation and interpersonal effectiveness, those are skills that quite frankly, we can all get better at. And so often if an individual really commits to a course of treatment in when they have borderline personality disorder, they can actually get to a point where they no longer meet criteria for the disorder. With individuals with narcissistic personality disorder, there are a lot of skills that could be helpful. What happens though is that they're less likely to come to therapy.
Right. Because if I'm correct with something like narcissistic personality disorder, it's really difficult to identify the flaws of oneself. So then you believe that everyone else around you needs to change or is the problem, and you have none.
Yeah.
Which is so hard for people who are in relationships with someone with that, or have family or have friends. How can people cope with feeling like they knew someone one way and now, you know, whether these disorders have gotten worse or more severe, or that you really can't help because you can't make someone do something that they don't want to do?
Yeah. I think that's the really tough part about it. And we've had some conversations about this, right? Like that it's so hard to see someone in a state that they're in and recognize like that there's like a really loving, gentle heart in there, or that there's like a better version of that person that in some ways you've seen or experienced, right? And you want that for them, but maybe they don't recognize it or have awareness in what's possible for them. And in a lot of cases, it's about really healthy boundaries. What's tough is that probably if you've had someone in your life like that, you've engaged in sort of unhealthy boundaries or very loose boundaries, because that's what sort of is pulled for in those relationships. And so for us, it would be like recognizing what healthy boundaries are for you in terms of how you want to relate and engage with those individuals. And then really self-care, like doing the work for yourself to understand like what's coming up for you and validating why it makes sense, regulating your own emotions, but also being really clear, as you said, what's in your control and what's out of your control. Spend a lot of time trying to sort of force people to see what we see, right, when they're not there. And so we're really not meeting people where we're at. And so when we can get to a place of acceptance, not condonement, not complacency, but acceptance with what is for someone, and let go of sort of the ideas or narratives of what we might think of that person or who we thought they were, or in some ways grieve or mourn the loss of what we experienced in a relationship before, we have a better opportunity to sort of move on from it in a healthy way.
Acceptance is one of, I think, the hardest things
hard
in life.
Yeah.
It really is. And it's that resistance to what is, which then makes things more difficult in turn, because you're just denying reality. Like, we're here. The more you think about it or wish it away, like nothing's going to happen differently. But it's so hard to kind of like let go of the reins or kind of drop the rope in a tug of war. And I mean, even in lighter ways in my own life, I've tried to really check myself on like, I see someone struggling who I think needs help and I could make their life easier, but if they're not asking for it, I'm no longer going to extend myself. And I do still say, like, you know, if you need anything, I'm happy to help you. And then, so I did it. I did my role. If they don't come ask, they don't come ask. Yeah. And that's so hard, because when you've had an epiphany in your own life and it's made your life better, you want that for every single person you come across.
It is really hard. That's a part of sort of the characteristics of certain personality disorders as well, is like, especially with borderline personality disorder, right? Someone might recognize that they need help. You're saying, hey, I think you need help. Like, here are these resources. How can I help you? How can I support you more? And they're saying, yes, I'm suffering. I need help. But the pendulum usually swings between I'm suffering and I need help, and like this apparent competence of like, yeah, I got it. I'm doing everything, because there's such like tension when we try to change. It's uncomfortable. Even when you have mental health and you're trying to make changes, it's uncomfortable. And so when someone is saying, I'm suffering, but I'm not actually going to do the things that I need to do to change that suffering, it pulls for you to do the work for them, right? When I'm in therapy with someone, I get pulled into that as well, because we believe in the change process, right? We've gone through the change process ourselves. And so it pulls for you. Then you find yourself sort of now outside of your boundaries again. You're doing their work for them because you see they're suffering and they want to change. And we can't do other people's work for them.
This makes me think of people who struggle with addiction to drugs. And I know people as well where, you know, it is, well, then you no longer can come sleep in this house, and you no longer can like be at these family functions, right? And then those families and those people struggle because it's like, are they homeless? Do they have money? What if they kill themselves? What if they get into serious trouble and they're killed? And so then it's like, do you enable, or do you, you know, stick to your boundary and hope? But then what if that doesn't work out? And fortunately for the people that I've known, it worked out beautifully, and that's great. And then there's people where it doesn't, and this person never comes around. So do you think that's the inevitable, like Sophie's choice of some of these dynamics, like, unfortunately? And then what would you say to someone who's like, but then it's on me if something terrible happens to this person, that I didn't just continue to get stomped over?
Yeah. I mean, it's a valid feeling, right? Like, if I didn't, then, right? We all have those thoughts, if then, right? And based on sort of the notion that we can affect change. Well, if I adjust, well, when you invite that person back into your home, they steal money from you and they go buy drugs. So maybe they have a roof over their house, but their addiction is being enabled, right? So we can't actually know if you had continued to support the person, if the same course or outcome would have happened. We can't predict the future. What we do know is that someone's behaviors, especially their consistency of behavior over time, can give us some sort of indication of what's happening. And so, you know, we all fall into this trap of like, I could have done more, based on sort of the moment in time where you're at, when we can't really know what the future is going to hold. But we do have some sense of like, if I continue doing this will continue to happen, right? And so if I continue to support this person, pay for this person, provide a roof for this person, keep giving them resources and doing the work for them, well, it's kind of the definition of insanity, right? Like doing the same thing over and over without and expecting some sort of change.
Right.
And it is really hard to sit with the idea that maybe I could have done more. And it's really hard to make the choice to stop sacrificing yourself and your own mental health and your family's well-being for someone that you love and care about. At the end of the day, it comes down to, and we can't answer these questions for people, right? Like, we can point out that, you know, in some ways you're being codependent or enabling, but we can't answer the question of like, where's the line of your values and your morals here, right? Like, because what we know, and this is a Dr. Mike sort of ism or saying, right, is that pain causes change. And unfortunately for some addicts, there's not enough pain to cause change. And it is really difficult to sit with. And so helping someone who's in that situation is really getting them to kind of recognize the traps in the way that they think about things. Well, if I just did this, then this could happen. And also get them back aligned with, okay, what are your values and like, how do you want to take care of yourself? That when this person is finally ready, you're actually like not a shell of yourself because you've been doing mental and physical gymnastics to sort of try to change their life for them. And the quality of the rest of your relationships in your life has suffered because you spent so much time trying to fix or save this person. Mm-hmm. So it's really coming back to kind of the values and morals and how someone wants to like show up and be.
When you say, and this is the quote, pain causes change, mm-hmm. which I love, there are instances where that change isn't the good change, right? Mm-hmm. And I just think about those who die by suicide. Mm-hmm. You're at that place, and there are people who we hear their hero stories of like, it was that moment that turns my life around, or I got the phone call from this person, mm-hmm. or I had this thought, or someone talked me, back and I didn't do it. Mm-hmm. And then there are people where we don't hear their story because mm-hmm. the change was unfortunately the end. Mm-hmm. Can you help people understand like what might cause someone to go one way versus another?
Yeah. First of all, when we talk about this and we say like what causes or it is kind of correlated to suicidal behaviors, we only get the data from the folks who either survive their attempts or don't actually attempt but are wrestling with urges and behaviors, right? So in some ways we're still hypothesizing because the folks that complete suicide, we don't get the data, right? And so generally speaking, there's a sense of hopelessness and burdensomeness that are common characteristics for individuals who engage in suicidal behaviors or make attempts, complete attempts, which is so tough to sit with because those are preventable things, right? And there are typically a series of experiences or events in addition to sort of our own internal ecosystem, right? Like the anxiety, the depression, what have you, that lead to someone attempting to take their life. So it's really challenging. And we also know that there are certain psychological skills and interventions that can help individuals who are wrestling with suicidal ideation to actually reduce their ideation, reduce the urges, reduce the amount of behaviors that they actually engage in.
Mm-hmm. I once gave a speech at a summit on mental health, mm-hmm. and I remember a male on faculty had come up and asked, like, why do you think there are, unfortunately, so many student athletes who do die by suicide? And then you have experienced the lows you described today, mm-hmm. and that wasn't mm-hmm. where your story went. And it's so interesting to think about that. And I feel like I always had some like small gauge of perspective. Mm-hmm. And even though I felt like at the time my whole life and world is my little day at USC, mm-hmm. even though like it really did feel that way, there was like this thing like deep down where I'm like, there's something off this campus. And it's like, I feel like that little knowing mm-hmm. of like what that is mm-hmm. saved me. Mm-hmm. And it's so crushing to think about the youth, especially, who do feel like their entire life is what they get on their finals mm-hmm. or what team they're playing on, or if they don't get recruited, or if they don't go to the Ivy League, or mm-hmm. if they don't go to the college that their parents wanted them to go to, mm-hmm. that the mind can convince you, well, then your whole life will not be worth it after this moment. Mm-hmm. It's crushing.
It's crushing. And we sometimes talk about like the dark side of high performance that doesn't get talked about. And if parents only knew, right, ahead of time, how dark it can be for their children when they're finally in positions, right, to sort of, what's the word I want to look for? Like manifest the reality that the parents have created for them, right? But it feels really hard to actually do it. Or your sense of self is so wrapped up in it that when you experience a setback, whether it's a low grade or you don't get to start or you're at the brink of not going pro or whatever it is, right? How dark and how sort of all-encompassing it can be for an individual. Parents would probably push their kids less in the ways that we're seeing them do it right now, right? It feels like a very lonely journey to be on the path of high performance for a lot of athletes, especially when they've been set up to do that, right? It's either you go to Ivy League or you're letting us down. And it's not like that message is explicit in most families, but it's the sort of implicit messaging that you always get, that I love you more when you're accomplished.
Or we're going to all have a family dinner tonight because of your grade.
Exactly. That sends the message that we're not enough. And I can't possibly seek support from the people who are telling me that I'm not enough when I'm not high achieving or when I'm not sort of doing the things that they want for me, versus I just want to study art or history, right?
Or I don't want to make tons and tons of money.
Yeah.
And I don't want to do all, like, I just want a different life. And it's like, people can't compute that because there's such a blueprint for what, quote, success means.
Yeah.
I can almost picture, though, not only parents listening and thinking, well, then how do I motivate my children, like, and help them reach their potential? And I can foresee myself struggling with that. I'll never be a mom who withholds love based on performance, hopefully. But, you know, I also don't think it's realistic for me to think I'll just be like monotone, win or lose the soccer game. Not that I would feel differently towards the kid, but you're thinking, I got to motivate them. Like, you've seen the movies, you've heard the stories of the parents that the athletes or the icons reference, oh, they always pushed me or they inspired me and then I did this thing. So it can be good and it can be bad.
Sure. I think this idea of like, I got to motivate them is really interesting. Why?
Me with no kids.
So they can be the I don't know, the 3% of youth sport athletes that actually go on to college, and the 2%, I'm making up numbers, right? 80% of stats are made up on spot, including that stat. But like
very low percentage.
So they can be the low percentage of youth sport athletes that actually go on to have a collegiate scholarship, and then the even minute percentage that go on from there to play pro and make good money, right? Like, why do you have to motivate them? What is the actual function of sports? What is the actual function of academics? It's so that kids can socialize. It's so kids can learn skills to be resilient. It's so kids can learn teamwork and collaboration, not so that they can be the next, right?
Yeah.
Fill in the blank. And so when we look at like, I gotta motivate, no, you're pushing someone to do something, right? And that's actually not what motivates someone. Motivation is really born out of sort of a sense of agency. I get to choose what I'm doing and I have control over it, and a sense of progression, right? Competency, I'm getting better at this. And then also connectedness. Not mom thinks I should do it or dad thinks I should do it. I got to work harder so that I can be a college athlete. That's not how motivation works. And so I got to motivate. The real thing to sort of think about is, how can I increase my kids' sense of agency with the thing that they're doing, and how can I highlight the ways that they're progressing, because that naturally feeds the fire of motivation. And what is it that they're most stoked about in the thing that they're doing? If your kid runs off the field and just missed, 5 attempts on goal as the goalie of the soccer team, but is so stoked to eat the PB&J, talk about the damn PB&J, right? Like, we are overlaying our own sort of vision for them in that experience, versus what are they actually excited about, and can we meet people where we're in that, because that is what motivates people.
As you describe it, I feel like my parents, did a really good job at that, because I never felt like, neither of my parents were elite athletes. They weren't. My papu, my mom's dad, played baseball in college, but that like skipped a generation. I remember going to the track and like running and doing my own workout plan and motivating myself with the quotes I pulled. And my parents never were like into sports that way. I don't know if I can speak for my older brother, Jonathan, because I think golf was more of the sport of our family and my parents, my dad. So I don't know. But still, to your point, I motivated myself enough to do really awesome things in sport that wasn't my parents. And it's possible because I love what I do. The same way with my career today, I think my parents don't know what goes on in the day. My dad, who's like, been incredibly successful and had many amazing business experiences, like, it is not apples to apples, like trying to even talk about what I do. And I do so much within it because I love to do it, so I have the motivation.
Yeah.
But not everyone is like that.
And what's wrong with that?
Well, when you know what you like, you assume everyone must do it your way.
Of course.
Like, you look at people and think, no, well, you should have like a career you're viscerally passionate about because that's what I have and I am happy.
Yeah.
And they might think that's just not what they want.
Mm-hmm. It's not what they want. It's also not reality. How many people realistically are just like viscerally passionate about their career? Like, we're so lucky. We're so lucky to have found ourselves in the spots that we're in. What I recognize when I'm with, on the side of consulting with the Fortune, 50 companies that I get to sort of weave in and out of, is what's more likely is the thing they do facilitates what they're most passionate about outside of the office building. And some of us are really lucky that there's like a great intersection between the two and we get to do the thing that we love to do and make money, right? But most people aren't that lucky. And so at the end of the day, we do have responsibilities. It's expensive to live. And if we can get to a place where we can support people in doing something that interests them and also foster a sense of passion, whether it's in the thing that interests them or outside of that, and have some sort of balance in their life, they're probably more likely to be mentally well, feeling supported regardless of what they do, rather than pushed towards something that fits sort of the scope of what we think they should be doing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then some of us, this is where genetic differences come in, right? Some of us just are a little grittier. Some of us just like enjoy like getting our ass kicked, right? Like, and it's like, hell yeah. And can stay connected to that despite sort of the difficulties around it, right? And not everyone's like that.
I really want to go on Fox Special Forces. Have you seen the show or heard of it? It's where like, celebrities train like Navy SEALs. And I like...
Oh, you'd crush it.
I really want to go on it. And whenever I say that, people are like, that would be my literal nightmare. Like, I would never want to subject myself to that. And so to your point, like, I don't know, like that would fire me up. Mm-hmm. Like, but then there's people who are like, no, thank you. I will take my coffee and my comfortable bed. And like, and that makes me think of what you always say to me, which I love, is be about it.
Yeah.
Whatever it is that you love, and it might be different, then just be about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's so powerful.
Yeah. And can we support people better in being about it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
How can we do that?
Again, I think it's looking for, right? Like we'll look for what we're looking for, right? Like if I want to walk down the street in West Hollywood and find reasons to be sort of depressed or find pessimism around me, I could find it. And if I wanted to walk down that same block in West Hollywood and find reasons to be grateful and reasons that the future is positive and optimistic, I can find that walking down the same street, right? So we fall into the trap of sort of, as we talked about, kind of overlaying our own experiences, our own mental like models for people. And it's a really, really sophisticated thing to sort of hold what's possible for someone and plant that seed, but then kind of step back and just water it sometimes and see where they take it. And maybe it's not like, maybe they don't water it. Why do we keep watering the same seed if someone's not watering it, right? So it's like figuring out and looking for what lights them up, what lights a person up, and then go with that, right? And when we can be in that with someone and they feel sort of supported and seen and a sense of belonging, they can be more vulnerable. They can be more accountable. And then when they need to pivot, which eventually we need to pivot in life and transition and change, then they feel like they can say, hey, I need to pivot. What's tough about sports, just going back to kind of, we had started a conversation around suicide and college athletes, is that there still isn't this felt sense that we can be vulnerable as athletes in high-level sports, because vulnerability is misconstrued as weakness. And so what I think also is a part of this is that whatever the ecosystem is, whether it's the ecosystem of the actual team, college that the person's involved with, or the ecosystem at home, there's still sort of this, I can't actually reach out and say, I'm really struggling, or I actually don't want to do this anymore because I'm afraid of what the response might be. Mm-hmm. And that's critically important. And so if we can find ways to meet people where they're at and help them learn how to be vulnerable at an early age, that sets them up right in the future for help seeking, support seeking when things are really difficult.
Mm-hmm. It can be hard to obviously do what you're saying, but more so the reality of, okay, well then I'll set the boundary, or I will stop watering that plant. But then it's still hard to go to bed at night when you feel like, oh, I'm centering myself. Or when you're so tied emotionally to how someone else is feeling that it's then hard to be happy in your own life because you've actually been so ingrained in the toxic cycle that you can't separate self from person I love who struggles.
Yeah. I think what we're talking about is the idea of like putting your own oxygen mask on first, right? And this idea that like, right, like we work ourselves up into this sort of anxious state of like trying to almost in some way like control someone else's behavior when we see it as sort of dysfunctioned or suboptimal. And then when they're actually like doing the things that we hope and love and want for them, we can't even recognize it because we're still sort of hyper focused on what could go wrong. And so it's really hard for us to be there for others if we're depleted, if we're not our best selves. And I know that there's some gender differences around that, right? Like for women, especially in high achieving careers, it feels like they can't prioritize themselves to be able to do that. But it is probably the most loving thing that you can do is to take care of yourself so that you can be a whole version of yourself and a healthy version of yourself when someone actually does need help, but then disengage from it in a healthy way when need be.
Thank you so much. This was such a lovely mental health chat, and I think it's so important, especially during this month of May, to be having open conversations and being vulnerable with people. And there are just so many great things that I think I'm gonna keep marinating that I can sit on and take with me. So thanks for coming back on the pod.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for also sort of being the ambassador of destigmatizing mental health. It's so important. I think the more that we can have these conversations and normalize these conversations, the more people will seek help, because it is part of the human experience to feel depressed, to feel anxious, and to have moments where maybe you feel hopeless or pessimistic about the future. And the more that we can normalize those experiences, the more readily we can move through them, right? And have great support around it. So thank you.
It means the world. I love that. Part of the human experience.
Yeah.
I'm going to think about that next time I'm feeling sad and depressed. This is part of the human experience. I can't perfect my way out of not ever experiencing this.
It is, and you can't.
Thank you.
Yeah.